Good morning, Excellencies. We are about to start, so please be seated. Richard? Good morning. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, both here in Addis Ababa and online. Good morning and welcome to this very important discussion on Africa and the African Union. My name is Atta-Asamoah, and I'm the head of the African Peace and Security Governance Program. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you, and I happen or have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's discussion. So you're welcome. Before we start, I would like to give a couple of joining instructions, especially for the benefit of our online audience. If you're online, please take note of the following. Kindly keep your mics and cameras off until the Q&A section. If you need to ask a question during the Q&A section, please make use of the raise hand function on your Zoom app. That is very important for us. At some point, an online poll will be launched. Do take a couple of minutes to complete the poll for us. It helps us understand the trend of issues and to improve how we run our events. And for all audiences, please take note that Chatham House rule does not apply because we are streaming. And so you may be quoted by someone you don't know somewhere across the world. So please take note of that. Having said that, I would like to welcome you once again. Please take note of the fact that this event is being co-organized by the Institute for Security Studies in collaboration with the IPSS, the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, IPSS, and Amani, Africa. And we are very excited to have you join us today. So that said, that clears the way for us to start the discussions, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, 2023, will go down in history as one of the most challenging years in the history of peace and security in Africa. At least the kind of history you and I know over the last 10 years. In last year, Africa experienced a lot of things, among which we all remember there was a worsening of the violent extremism trends in the Sahel. We saw the withdrawal of peacekeeping troops in some parts of the continent. We saw the war in Sudan worsening. We saw the emergence of defiant coup leaders who have no regard for regional or continental norms. And there's clear signs of a deterioration of governance indicators on the continent. And so essentially, we all agree that 2023 was a very, very challenging year for the continent. In the midst of that, there were several achievements as well and responses to these things. So today, what we are trying to ask and reflect on is, between those challenges and the responses, how did Africa fare and how is the AU faring? And by extension, what should we expect in 2024? And today we have very distinguished people who will be helping us get into the nuances of that subject. And I will introduce them very soon, including some of the changes that we've experienced overnight. But before I do that, I would like to invite one of our partners from the Institute for Peace and Security Studies to give us opening remarks. And so I would like to welcome Jesu Temelane, or Akamo. He happens to be the coordinator of the Research and Policy Analysis Unit at the IPSS. He will give us opening remarks before we launch out into the event itself. So I would like to welcome you for the opening remarks before I introduce the speakers, and then we take off from there. Do you want to speak from there? Or you want to come this way? Please come this way. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. To avoid confusion with my name, you can just call me Timmy. I'm here on behalf of the director of the Institute, Dr. Fana Gebresembet, who will not be able to join us today. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Pre-AU Summit Hybrid Seminar on Between Challenges and Responses, How is the AU Faring? As usual, we at the Institute for Peace and Security Study are very happy to co-organize this hybrid seminar with the Institute for Security Studies, and this here joined by Amani Africa. As leading think tanks based in Addis Ababa, closely working with the African Union, it behoves upon us to collaborate and create such platforms for productive discourse to advance Africa's governance, development, and peace and security agenda. The 37th Ordinary Heads of States and Government Summit is only 10 days away. As you will all agree, we are currently living in testing times and contexts. There is no end in sight for the Russia-Ukraine crisis, while a news flashpoint started in October 2023 in the Middle East. The consequences of this crisis in the Middle East upped insecurity along the Red Sea. In 2023, some 3 African countries defaulted on their loans, while the international community is slow to respond to the restructuring requests of many African countries, as big economies are yet to fully reel away from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic that broke out in 2020, as well as other crises. The rules-based order is also being challenged within our continent. While the cessation of hostilities agreement signed in Pretoria between the federal government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, is holding for Ethiopia, insecurity and conflict in the largest regions of Ethiopia, that's Oromia and Amara, is concerning. Sudan is suffering under the fighting between RSF and SAF, which is nearing its first-year mark. In West Africa, problematic electoral processes, the unconstitutional changes of government, military or civil, and the withdrawal of 3 ECOWAS member states are a blow to regionalism and integration. The constellation of other complexities with respect to the politics of recognition in East Africa, impediments to a sustainable peace in the Great Lakes region, the growth, spread, and resilience of terrorism and violent extremism in Southern Africa and the Sahel, and the stalemate scenario in Libya further creates a more challenging landscape in the pursuit of peace and stability on the continent. Meanwhile, all these are exacerbated by the need for more inclusive approaches, respect for the rights of Africans the impact of climate change, and the state of the economy of most African countries. There are also some encouraging signs to build upon. In relation to the international system, these include progress in the implementation of the AFCFTA, the AU's permanent member status at the G20, and Africa's agency through the AU in pursuit of the new agenda for peace and its role in the summit of the future. Within the continent, we continue to witness AU's recognition of the need to prioritize prevention, women and youth inclusion, data-driven approaches to policy and programmatic interventions, the strengthening of member states' capacities to conflict prevention, successes on cementing the African-led solutions approach in some intervention outcomes and ongoing processes, reiteration of the workability of the principle of subsidiarity, interstate and interinstitutional coordinations and partnerships, willingness of the AU and REX member states to continue to mediate and negotiate, and increased recognition of the role of civil society and think tanks in enhancing the prognosis of Africa's political and economic stability. Accordingly, this hybrid seminar is organized to address the following key objectives. First, to review 2023 from the perspective of numerous challenges the continent faced and expectations for 2024. Two, reflections from the outgoing chair on achievements made, challenges faced, and lessons learned, and the ways of improving the AU's roles. And third is expectations of issues to be covered in the agenda of the AU's 37th summit. Lastly, I am sure that the excellent speakers, Ambassador Mohamed Arouchi, Morocco's permanent representative of the AU and UNECA, Ambassador Fred Gateretse Ngonga, African from the AU Commission, and Dr. Solomon Dreso, Director, Amani Africa, will help us to properly reflect on these key objectives. Finally, I wish you all a wonderful and productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think in the midst of those issues, the array of issues that he raised in his opening remarks, we're asking, as you can see, between those challenges and responses, even if you add achievements, how is the AU faring in all of this? And that is why we are here this morning. And I would like to welcome the names that Timmy mentioned as we start. So today we have three distinguished speakers in addition to himself. He'll be joining us during the Q&A session. But to start with, Dr. Paul Simon will come. He's the Regional Director of the Institute for Security Studies in East Africa. And he will be followed by Dr. Solomon Dreso. You all know him. And then Ambassador Fred will join us online. And so we will bring him on board, and he's going to stay with us throughout the discussions. So there'll be more time for a lot. Gentlemen, you will have 10 minutes each to unpack your ideas, after which all of you will speak, and then we'll have the Q&A section. But let me clarify. We initially had Ambassador Mohamed Arouchi joining us, but he had to, on a very short notice, had to attend to some pressing issues. And that is why we brought Dr. Paul Simon to stand in his place. So just take note of those changes. And so that said, I would like to invite Dr. Paul Simon, who will be addressing us on AU in 2023, achievements, challenges, and lessons learned. Dr. Paul Simon, you have the floor. Feel free to sit as you wish. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am very pleased to be here, but you know very well that I wasn't the first choice of my colleagues to stand in here. So I'm some sort of spare wheel, but fortunately we have one. So the troubleshooter. So, so we but nonetheless, I'm very pleased to be here to be sharing these panel with my friends and colleagues. Being the first speaker, I will try and widen a bit the context under which we should be assessing the AU's role or the AU's performance in 2023. And I'll start a bit high up with the tale of two broken multilateralisms. Because to understand what the AU is facing, I think we need to see the AU in its international context. The first broken multilateralism with which we are grappling is, of course, the global multilateralism. Global multilateralism is in crisis, and this is manifested in many ways. We have a crisis of peacekeeping, which, in my view, epitomizes the crisis of what we can call the crisis of international solutions to crisis, to conflict. We have a debt crisis that is increasing, not just in Africa. We also have a crisis of international financial institutions, which, beyond the issue of representation, also has to deal with the capacity of those international finance institutions in supporting development in many parts of the world. And all those crises are also happening against the background of deepening mistrust of international and regional, towards international and regional organizations. So there's a growing mistrust. We see that in Africa, in the Sahel, with the mistrust of certain countries regarding regional economic communities. And then that also leads to some sort of solutions, minilateral arrangements, solutions to deal with specific problems. As much as they deal with specific problems, they might be also, in some point, maybe challenging the order, the multilateral order. So we have a multiplication of G forums and BRICS Plus. Not that they are a problem, but they are a manifestation of a growing mistrust towards existing multilateral institutions. The second broken multilateralism is African. Multilateralism in Africa is broken. It is in crisis. And we see that also in many ways. First of all, I think African multilateralism struggles to find sustainable homegrown solutions to regional conflict systems. The Great Lakes, for example, has been a problem for decades without African multilateral arrangement being able to find a solution. The Sahel is another conflict system. And beyond the Sahel, it's also not necessarily a conflict system, but a widening trend of insecurity, violent extremism, to which African multilateral arrangements are increasingly unable to find solutions. Another manifestation of these African multilateralism in crisis is also the difficulty, the growing difficulty of African regional organizations to find solutions to a deepening problem, namely interstate crisis, crisis between 2 or 3 countries. We have some rifts between countries, some of which sometimes even affect the ability of regional organizations or even the AU to operate as we wish it to operate. We have one of them between Algeria and Morocco, Egypt, Ethiopia, DRC, Rwanda. And there are probably more to come. The worrying trend here is sometimes how the solution to those crises is rather seen in terms of extraversion, of having non-African trying to bring solutions to African problems. But the crises of multilateralisms are also exacerbated by the demise of what we used to call hegemons, anchor states. Strong African states able to take responsibility within their region and solve problems. I mean, all the big, let's call them the big guys, are struggling with internal problems. Think of South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia. Another would be big guy, Sudan is in a deep war. So many of the states that were deemed capable of actually acting as regional anchors are faced with internal problems, and that diminishes the capacity to actually take responsibility. How does the AU fare in it? Mr. Chair, I'll finish on time. The AU remains the premier African organization that develops vision of collective and acceptable behavior within the African continent. So it's the recognition of the AU in that regard remains quite stable. Regional economic communities at the regional complement these collective at the regional level. So in 2023, the AU achieved many gains. I will name two, and I'm sure my colleagues will have more to say. The first one is probably that happened, I see that as a gain. Yeah? It happened quite late in the year, in December, the passing of UN Resolution 2719 on access to assessed funding, UN funding. I see that as a gain because it has been a long-standing request. It has been an issue that the AU with the UN has been negotiating for years. And I think it's not just a question of having access to funds, but rather a way not just of finding an answer to international subsidiarity, the role of regional organizations, but also in enabling the AU and African RECs to take more responsibility in peace support operations, not just conflict management, which as such is also in crisis. This is the first response. But another gain, I see another gain in the AU's admission into the G20. And this is a massive milestone beyond the satisfaction of seeing the G20 having not just an African member, because South Africa is already a member of the G20, but what is interesting here is that for the first time, the AU is taking an international role. The AU is the only regional organization with the European Union to be member of the G20. But what does that mean for the AU? What kind of international actor is the African Union? How will the AU, alongside South Africa, will represent Africa? South Africa does not represent Africa, it represents South Africa, but the AU will represent Africa. But what are Africa's interests? How does the AU represent those African interests within the G20? How, if those interests might contradict South Africa's interests, how will it be managed? So the AU is entering into a new terrain with this G20. The AU will have to have some opinions about, let's say, the development of the ballistic program in North Korea. So it's an AU 3.0 that does not only deal with African problems, but actually now should be part of finding solutions to international problems. So new terrain, exciting, but the AU should be prepared as well. But these gains, in my view, are being reaped against the background of some major headwinds. The first is linked to what I call the crisis of multilateralism. The first headwind is what we can consider the end of a consensus that led to the development of some major initiatives in Africa. We see the end of this consensus. African countries disagree, for example, of the very important anti-coup d'etat norm today. Not that the norm is being questioned, but the management of coup is being questioned. We see ECOWAS literally being torn apart between its members on the right type of response that the organization should be bringing to the management of coup d'etat. So, but they certainly, I'm not one of those who will make the AU or ECOWAS responsible for the crisis. In my view, the responsibility lies with member states. We should not expect our regional organization to be better than the sum of its parts. So they will be what member states want them to be. And there, I think it's a bit unfair to accuse ECOWAS for the failures of actually West African states. The same will go for the AU as well. Yes, I'll end, Chair. The question remains also on how we restore consensus between African states to drive both ECOWAS, the AU, and other RECs to develop responses for the next challenges. The second headwind relates to the AU institutional reform. I hope my colleagues will actually elaborate a bit more on that. But the reform, at some point, even looks like it needs a reform. The reform is kind of stalled, and needs a new push. The third one is the AU's, but I've already mentioned it, the AU's role in global governance and the type of institutional capacity that should be developed within the AU Commission to drive the AU's meaningful participation into global governance, because it's going to be different from what the AU has actually known today. This capacity can be, for example, developed, I don't know, with the AU developing internal capacity, because I don't think that the AU should be outsourcing this capacity, but finding it or developing it within. And there are many options, including a new role for NEPAD in that regard, or an additional role, not a new one. So, so I could be developing some more headwinds that the AU is facing, but as an academic, I also want to respect time. So Chair, I'll stop there first, and I'm sure we'll be coming back in the Q&A session. Thank you.
You will have so much time to unpack a lot of these. And I feel you've left so many questions that will set us off for an interesting discussion. But I do appreciate the fact that you mapped out the global context within which we need to appreciate or assess the AU's performance, particularly the issues of global multilateralism, as well as, Africa's struggle with multilateralism. And what you say is the emergence of a 3.0 AU in the midst of all of this, and how you interlace that with the challenges and realities and achievements. Of course, the headwinds are things we will all interrogate going forward. And so thank you so much. For the online audience, please, if you have questions or comments, keep them coming, because I'm monitoring that platform as well. I would like to now turn to Dr. Solomon Deso, the director of Amani, and he is unpacking Africa in 2023 and expectations in 2024. Issues in governance, peace, and security. Dr. Deso, you have the floor. If you can keep it 10 minutes, very provocative, that will be appreciated.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Let me start off by extending Amani Africa's appreciation to the Institute for Security Studies and the Institute for Peace Studies, IPSS, at Addis-Ababa University, for co-partnering in the organization of this pre-summit event. Wish to thank in particular Paul, with whom we discussed this last year, and it's really great to see this coming to fruition. I wish also to thank each and every one of you for joining us this morning. I think both Timmy and Paul have covered quite a lot of ground in terms of looking back to 2023. And of course, Andrew started it when he said 2023 must be remembered for being one of the very difficult years in terms of the peace and security conditions that we have experienced. Admittedly, if you link that with what Paul was saying in terms of putting this dire, assessment in the global context, it looks like that it's not simply an African issue that we are having; it is a global crisis that we are experiencing. I think from a perspective of looking back to 2023, if you look at the governance trends, one trend that you clearly see, which started, you may take it to 2019 or 2020, depending on the cutting point that you wish to take, is the resurgence of military coups. And that persisted into 2023. And we have seen two countries experiencing military seizure of power: Niger in June, Gabon in August. And the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, for the first time, suspended 2 member states in 1 calendar month in August, both Niger and Gabon. What is interesting about the occurrence of military coups and actually the persistence, the continuation of this resurgence of military coups is what it suggests us about, first, I think the generational change, the demographic change that has happened on the continent. It looks like that, the generation of Africans who have lived through military dictatorships are phasing out. And many today, the vast majority of people on the continent, do not have memories of living under military dictatorship and the kind of, trouble that comes with that kind of order, socially, economically, politically, in human security wise, and indeed in terms of state-society relationship, as well as the functioning of the state itself, right? I think it's important to also bear that in mind. The other aspect of it that is worth bearing in mind is that who on its own is the problem, but most importantly, it is actually a manifestation of a systemic problem. Because if you look at each of the coups, each of them are specific to its own context, no doubt about that. But at the same time, it is also developing other manifestation of deeper crises in that particular context. And these deeper crises relate to the governance domain. So the failure, increasing failure and deficit to deliver on the social, economic, security needs of populations is one of the factors that drives this. The second one is institutional deficiencies of different kinds, but most important one is basically the fact that institutions of checks and balances are not able to hold those in power to account and to provide what may be considered to be self-correction. And the result is basically that those in position of power would operate as if they are absolute monarchs with no restraint. And sectors of society in that kind of conditions are left with no choice. And it is in that condition that, various disputes would create the opportunity for the military to step in. And you see people clapping for that. It's not so much that they are clamoring for military dictatorship. It's just that becomes the resort, or the intervention of the military becomes the only avenue for putting a check on an accountable system of governance. So here, what you find is basically that the crisis in terms of the multilateral orders at the continental level is that there are at least two crises that you see there. The first crisis has to do with the fact that they deal with coups after the fact, post fact. They are just reaction to coups, right? They don't deal with and address the circumstances that precipitate coups. Today, what is happening in Senegal? Tim mentioned unconstitutional change of government of both a military kind and a civil kind. And this crisis that is unfolding in Senegal, for one reason or another, if it's going to lead to the kind of situation that unfolded, for example, in Gabon, with the military saying, look, we have to take matters into, our hands. What are we doing about it in order to ensure that this actually doesn't happen? That this civilian unconstitutional change of government or coup is actually reversed. I think that is the litmus test in terms of you deploying the tools of prevention ahead of military coups occurring. And this is a moment for testing exactly that kind of thing, right? And then, of course, the data from, for example, Afrobarometer also shows the kind of crisis I think that we are continuing to witness. I think Timmy mentioned the issue of rigged, flawed elections. So elections have become a norm on the continent, which is a good thing. But at the same time, the phase of people in elections being an avenue for bringing about change of leadership has not been increasing. It is actually declining. So unless we fix these, issues, it would be difficult really to see these warring trends not continuing. That is why what is happening in Senegal today for 2024 should give us, a signal of what may be coming to 2024 and what happened in Niger and, of course, in Gabon, the possibilities of similar events coming in other countries as well. So I think, from the governance dimension of it, from a peace and security dimension of it, I think there are, of course, a number of issues that we can think of, but one of them has to do with the trade of expansion of conflicts, what we in Amani Africa call conflicts involving terrorist groups. And here, I think it's not simply the increase in the incidence of attacks and fighting involving these groups, but also the geographic expansion of the phenomena. Now, the coastal states of West Africa facing increasing push and pressure with the epicenter of terrorism expanding from the Sahel towards the coastal states that we have experienced. You clearly see this data continuing to increase in the course of 2023. We have our annual review as Amani Africa that we produce on the Peace and Security Council, which is coming at the end of the week, which actually shows and highlights this. But one very important aspect from what Paul said about the global situation that is very important to pay attention to, that has become so profoundly consequential in 2023 is the intensification of geopolitical contestation on the African continent. And one region that profoundly illustrates this is the Horn of Africa. If you think about the analysis that we often do with respect to the horrendous war that broke out in Sudan in April, one of the things that we often do is basically we focus on the main actors, the RSF, the SF, and the battlefield dynamics in relation to that. But one thing that is the most influential dynamic of that is the role of the power play involving Gulf countries, taking really a very heavy hand in the level of their intervention in this region. It's not just specific to the situation in Sudan. You see it playing itself out in Somalia. You see it playing itself out here in Ethiopia, between Ethiopia and Somalia, and so on and so forth. I think that is really one aspect, but the Horn of Africa is just one example. You see it playing itself out in the Great Lakes region. You see it playing itself out in the Sahel and the Central African regions. It's not just middle powers who have become so assertive in trying to flex their muscles, but also contestations involving, for example, struggle pitting Russia and France in the Sahel, for example, is one other manifestation. Of course, there is a broader manifestation of that we need to pay attention to. One, I think, yes, Andrew. A couple of points, and then I will stop. I think one thing that I wish to indicate is that the institutions, the multilateral institutions such as the African Union and the ECOWAS and so on and so forth, I don't know if they have a problem as far as the tools, the norms, and the institutional arrangements is concerned. I think the problem that they are running into is a problem of what I call agency. It is a problem of leadership. It is a problem of leadership both at the political level and I dare say at a technical level as well. It is these combinations of leadership crises that actually, because ask yourself, for example, in terms of the response of whether ECOWAS or the African Union, capacity-wise, institutional setup-wise, is the African Union worse today in 2023 than it was, let's say, in 2008, in 2009, in 2005? Years when the African Union has been delivering in a way that was incredibly commendable. And that was actually the reason why the AU has come to be recognized for being a leader. Those were also the years when ECOWAS has also been delivering, and it is the case that these institutions all of a sudden lost their institutional capacity and therefore It is the institutional arrangement and setup that's the problem. That is why the agency question has to be front and center in our interrogation of what is exactly the problem. When we talk about the crisis of the state system, whether it is the big countries that Paul mentioned, like Nigeria or South Africa, I don't think that this is also unique to these countries. These countries operate in a particular international arena and setup. And name a single country that is really doing well in the world today, big powers included. There is a crisis of a state system, writ large, not just specific to the African continent, that we need to bear in mind. One last point, I think, therefore, that I would like to put on the table is the issue of leadership. So important, both technical, but also political. These are the critical ingredients that would facilitate the possibilities for finding solution to difficulties and challenges and crises. Without this, it becomes difficult. The structural conditions are such that, indeed, the international economic order that Paul made reference to, as well as Tim, I mean, this is making life difficult, and there's something fundamental that needs to be done. Looking into 2024, just one statement. Where did we start? The year started on the 1st of January with a gift from the Horn of Africa in the form of an interstate fist fight of sorts, not literally, but figuratively, right? That triggered, a very difficult, what you may consider to be nationalism, very dangerous form of nationalism that can actually reverse gains that have been made, for example, in the context of Somalia, right? And this is one manifestation of, for example, the declining trust between leaders, between governments that Paul Simon made reference to. We have seen also, for example, the announcement from Egypt with respect to the negotiations on the Nile of basically withdrawing from that. This is basically, we have seen the announcement by Burkina, Mali, and Niger of their walking out of ECOWAS or breaking their marriage, whichever one wishes to look at it. And this brings me to the third point, which has to do with actually the crisis that regional orders are facing. You see, we witnessed in 2023 the collapse of the G5 Sahel. And what else are we witnessing? Sudan announced that it has suspended its engagement with IGAD. Now, me, I am not on the sunshine or the sunny part of life. So let me leave you with those sober reflections from my side. Thank you very much.
And on the note, very sober reflections, giving us a sense of what is likely to happen in 2024. I think I take note of a couple of things which we need to understand in understanding the dynamics. The phasing out of the generation of people who suffered under coups, and the rise of a new generation who have no idea what coups can do. The failure of states to meet their economic security and security needs of citizens and the impact, the inability of institutions to hold defaulters of constitutional provisions to account, and other related things. But I want to take this as something we should take with us. And quoting you, you said, who is a problem as well as a manifestation of the systemic problems the country faces. And I think that summarizes quite a bit the kind of governance challenges we faced on the continent. There are a number of issues being raised on the chat, but I'll bring them up during the Q&A session. I would like to turn to Ambassador Fred. He is joining us online. Ambassador Fred, if you are ready, please just put your video on. And he is going to give us a sense of what to expect in the upcoming summit. What should we expect in this summit? Ambassador Fred, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much, Andy. First of all, I would like to thank IPSS for inviting me, and I would like to apologize for not being there in person. I kind of have a viral infection which is going around, and I didn't want to spread it to the room. So my apologies. I would have loved to be there in person with Solomon and Paul to discuss some of the issues. I think before I can talk about what should be expected, I think that a lot has been said, but I would like to make a few points. I think that everybody has talked about the challenges, but I would like to project a little bit in terms of what the thrust of our efforts will be, especially in 2024. I think that we need more AU, not less AU, actually. When you look at the challenges we have right now, we need a more efficient AU that can really respond to prevent conflicts, but also respond to ongoing crises that we're dealing with. So I think that's extremely important. The AU is not the AU Commission. The AU is its member states, as Paul has stated it. And I would just like to remind what is the key agenda that we have. The first agenda is peace and security. The second agenda is governance. The third agenda is regional integration. The fourth agenda is voice and effective representation. And I think that going forward, a lot of efforts will be made in that direction, not only to deal with matters of peace and security as much as we can, and also to respond to some of the crises that are emerging while adjusting our tools. We need to find ways of dealing with the issue of sovereignty. This issue has actually been hampering some of our efforts, and I believe that we need to look into it, and these are conversations we need to start discussing so that we can actually be able to intervene on time and respond in such a way that we don't have shackles as we try to move along. We need to ensure that mechanisms to sustain agreements are respected. We need to put in place mechanisms to sustain agreements. There should be consequences when agreements reached are breached. And this is something that actually we need to be looking into. We need to re-energize back-channel diplomacy, because waiting for the right choreography of international bureaucracies to get things in order will actually cause people to die. We need to restore trust between us and our member states. I think it's important. If you see, Paul was talking about the question of multilateralism, but if you see in the UN, you see in all the multilateral organizations, there is a trust deficit between the organization and the member states. And the way you see it is through the issues of funding that are there. I was reading this morning as I was preparing, I was reading actually what happened in the 1990s, the last time that such a similar transformation was occurring in the world. In the 1990s, the then Secretary General of the African Union, or AU at that time, General Salim Ahmed Salim, responded by convening a summit. And during that summit, he presented a report, and the report was called Fundamental Changes Taking Place in the World and Their Implications for Africa, Proposal for an African Response. His proposal was basically calling for reforms, number one. Number two, it adopted a body of norms and standards and principles. And then number three was important. It was about shared values, advancing governance, democracy, and human rights, which at that time, actually, most of our countries were a bit reluctant to discuss as they saw that being an interference. I think that we are somewhat around that time where we need to look at where does Africa position itself vis-a-vis what is about to happen. And this brings me to what to expect actually in the current summit. I think that the peace and security will definitely be on top of the agenda. And this will focus, of course, on the situation in Libya, Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, looking at some of the challenges that we've been dealing with for quite some time and new challenges that are emerging. I think someone had mentioned the issues related to the Red Sea dynamics. When it comes to peace and security also, they will be looking at Resolution 2719. And yes, I do agree with Paul We have made significant progress, but we need to unpack 2719 to really understand what it means, because our peace support operations, because we do peace support operations, not peacekeeping, were efficient because of their flexibility, agility, and speed. And we must make sure that what comes, that some of the bureaucracy does not actually hamper us from advancing fast, and also unpack what 25% means, which is there. So beyond the issues of peace and security, like I highlighted, Libya, Sahel, the Great Lakes region, and the Horn, we will also be looking into what I would call background noise. The background noise, we're talking about, for example, the impact of the crisis in the Middle East, and what it means for Africa. I'm sure the impact of Russia, Ukraine, which continues to be felt, with us, and of course the Red Sea politics, as they mentioned. The other important agenda item that we'll be looking at will be the report on the AU's role in the G20. As you know, they will be looking into that. That's an important document which will be looked into. And then, of course, the report of the C10 on the reform of the UN Security Council. There will be some institutional issues which will be dealt internally, like the PSC rotation, for example, AU internal reform, even perhaps the issue of division of labor between the AU and the Rex RM. So these are some of the issues we'll be discussing. I would like also to highlight that there is another issue which I will call diaspora issue, which might come up. It is the issue of Haiti. As you know, support to Haiti has been in the discussions. Our commissioner, actually, for political affairs, peace and security, recently attended a meeting organized by the Organization of Francophonie to look into how to support Haiti. So these are some of the issues that will be discussed. We will look also at the Peace Fund, where there's a lot of progress that has been made, and how to ensure that that effort is sustained. So I would like to just stop here. I don't want to say much because I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and we will get into the question. And I would like to recognize, I think I saw my colleague, Dr. Akok, who's there with me, and he can also say a few words when doing the Q&A when we get a chance. So thank you so very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I can see Dr. Akok, so I think he should get ready. I will start the Q&A with him. But Ambassador, so much for giving us a sense of the key issues. I think for us, the issues of the Sahel, Libya, Great Lakes, the Red Sea issues, 2019 UN Security Council resolution, and the host of issues you raised are very critical for us to understand. I think we'll be coming to you to give us more of your projection of what is likely to emerge from all of these discussions. Not that you have what it takes to read the future, but it will be good to see what your expectations are vis-a-vis what will pan out. So thank you so much. Please stay on. I know you have a very busy schedule, but we want to have you during the Q&A session. So I would like to now turn to the room for the range of comments and questions you will have. I'm thinking of sparing Dr. Akok, but anytime you want to come in, please feel free. But I can start with you. We will take in the first round in three questions, then the panel will respond to that. Dr. Akok, we'll give you the mic first, then you, and then I'll come back to you, please. Yes, and then you. Please start with Dr. Akok.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andy. And Ambassador Fred tried to ambush me while I was ready to make an intervention. But allow me to make two comments. With regards to this UCGs in Africa, which is now a trending challenge that is facing the AU and facing all of us. We are trying to be concerned of why military taking over from the elected leaders. And I think that is not how we can address the root causes of usages in Africa. I believe there are fundamental structural problems that need to be addressed. And if we don't address them, we will continue to witness usages in Africa. And these structural causes are a social contract between leaders and the people. And the people, and the leaders are failing African people in addressing those public goods. And all these failures in those countries tend to be scapegoat on sorry history of Africa or humiliating history of Africa, whether it is slavery, whether it is colonization, as a causes of why these countries are failing to provide public goods. Despite colonization has been 60 years ago, we are still thinking that is a cause, which I think is a wrong diagnosis of why these countries are failing, leading to the militaries taking over. Botswana was colonized. Where is Botswana today? Namibia just got independence. Where is Namibia today? We have countries that have never been colonized. We have, for example, our hosts here. We have Liberia, for example. But more importantly, China was colonized twice. Where is China? So I think until we call the spade, we'll not be able to find a solution. For me, the deficit in leadership. And we must address what is wrong with African leadership. Why are we not up to the task of leading our people, our countries? Second, give me 2 more minutes. Second intervention is that the African Union has been focusing on intra-state conflict. Yes, there are a lot of achievements, but still there are a lot of challenges. But personally, I'm seeing there is emergence of interstate, which could be very devastating if we don't address this as soon as possible. And I think this is being caused by 2 things. First, resource competition, especially resources that lies across the borders. Second, cross-border communities, where, as we all know, our borders were crafted for us, or were kept by the Europeans. You'll find that communities are cut close. And if you see that your kings are being mistreated or excluded, that creates a sympathy of a support, which also creates a problem between the 2 states. So my question, what is the AU should do really to try to prevent, if possible, interstate or emerging interstate conflict? We have seen many of them, and they were mentioned. So these are the 2 of my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give the mic to the person next to you. But there's a point you make which I think we need to unpack, maybe in a different forum. The fact that we are seeing a semblance of emergence, I'm choosing the words advisedly, of interstate conflicts. But let's remember that this is one domain, among others, that the AU has done so well. And so we should start asking ourselves, if that goes off the cards as an achievement, what would become of the AU in the context of our discussions? But thank you so much. For those who don't know, Dr. Akok is the head of mediation at the AU. So I gave him time to unpack because we are interested in knowing more from the AU. But if you take the mic, please keep it brief, straight to the point so we can entertain more questions. Please.
Morning, and thank you very much for interesting presentations. My name is Joel Dahlberg from the Embassy of Sweden. And my question is related to Dr. Akok's question. That in the last 20 years, we spent huge resources when it comes to conflict prevention, dialogue, mediation, etc. But the sad fact seems to be that these are solutions that are not in demand any longer. There are about 15 ongoing mediation processes in Africa, been ongoing for a long time, and the number of conflicts are rising. So my question is really, what kind of tools do you see ahead of you when it comes to conflict resolution, given the background that dialogue and mediation doesn't seem to be in demand?
Important question. Think, let's take a lady, please. I'll come to you. One lady, then I'll add 2 questions from the online audience. Then we will respond to that. Whoever has the mic, please go. Yes.
Thank you so much. Regarding the G20 and the
Please, your name and
yes, I am Rosie Rodriguez from the Embassy of Mexico.
okay.
I am the political attaché. So I was in the membership. It is known that Sherpas and Sherpas to ideally stay for a little bit more than a year, ideally, to be part of the commitments throughout the year regarding the G20. So I was wondering if you had a roadmap or there was some information about the process on deciding the leadership for that summit and how would it be taken into consideration, let's say, from the country of the presidency of the AU, or if it's going to be a decision of the Commission. So just looking forward to see what was on your mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So gentlemen, take note of this. How do we prevent interstate conflict? The question around tools that have been developed but are not being used regarding mediation, take note of that. And then the question around the G20. But I want to add 2 from the online audience, from Charles Atia. He is saying, please comment on the courage of the AU to take on the issues of governance in individual states, regardless of the principle of non-interference. And then Dr. Tolit Charles, see the same person? Okay, he has a second question. Says, what measures has the African Union taken in the past to address military coups in member states? And how effective have these measures been? If I could add one, Andrew Sonia says to Dr. Deso, does the challenge of leadership and agency about within the institutions point to a challenge within the public participation frameworks of these institutions? Can the ability of citizens to impact the decisions of REX and the AU be improved? It's more about citizen participation. Please, if you respond to them so we can take it. Can I start with you, Dr. Simon?
Thank you. It's a bit difficult to choose which one to address. Let's address on the one hand, the AU has been relatively, as Andy was saying, successful in creating norms of collective behavior, of a pact of non-aggression. I mean, these are key steps. And indeed, historically, we have very few interstate conflicts in Africa. I mean, we can easily count them because there haven't been many. but there are tensions, and in some places we are close to war, actually, or war, like in the Great Lakes. So there is a problem there, and I don't have the feeling that the AU has a plan in the Great Lakes to avert that. I'm not sure there's an AU strong engagement between Morocco and Algeria, for example. I understand it's extremely difficult, but there is no, I think what is useful is to exhaust existing possibility of diplomatic engagement, particularly in areas, I mean, when you have opportunities like a summit and the multiple gatherings that we have. But some conflicts, interstate conflicts or tensions are more difficult than others. So, and that's where I think ACOC as the head of mediation, I think we should put our heads collectively together and see how to address those particular tensions. I'd like to say a few things about coup. I mean, some of us say it here in the panel, Solomon stressed it, Fred as well. Coups are a pathology. They are a pathology of governance. A symptom of something, as Solomon was saying. You do not address coup as such. You address what makes them possible. And let's be completely clear. Coups are also a symbol, manifestation of
abarundi bafite imbaraga zizabakiza iki kintu ari nazo zishobora kukibateza.
I think it's okay. Coups are also a manifestation of the crisis. I'm not sure if it's a crisis, but of teething problems of African states. African states remain young, despite the 60 years that ACOC was mentioning. Still relatively state, yeah, for the age of the broader scheme of history. They're young. And as young states, institutions, they still have teething problems. Institutional checks and balances are weak. They remain where they exist. They're not strong. Remember that countries like Mali were celebrated at one time as beacon of democracies. Yeah, we can't believe it, but Senegal is knocking at the door of potential autocracies. Yeah, what is happening in Senegal now is probably setting the ground for a coup. We might have a coup in Senegal because clearly there's an attempt at capturing the electoral process to impose candidates that are probably more amenable to some constituencies. This, in any case, is a breach of electoral rules, and it's probably also an interruption of Senegalese democratic process. So coups are a pathology, and the AU and the REX have been extremely successful in the last 20 years, 25 years. The introduction of the anti-coup norm and its implementation has actually led, if you look at the map of coups in Africa, there's a clear inflection, there's a clear decline from the moment the norm was set to recently. So there has been a decline. And of course, in recent years, we are rather moving up the ladder. So I think we should learn the lessons of what worked well. I think the international context was also quite key in creating the conditions for an anti-coup norm. That same international context is also driving the process of the increase in coups today? Because autocracies are becoming sexy again. They are supported by many, in many quarters. We have examples of autocratic economic success. Meaning that probably explains why some people think military governments might actually also bring about some economic success. But the question I've been asking, studying the trajectories of African states, is if you compare African military dictatorships with Southeast Asian dictatorships, you see that on the one hand, the dictatorship has actually led to sustainable economic growth. And in Africa, it has actually led to economic disaster. So military dictatorship in Africa has not been successful in at least creating the conditions for economic growth. So we should ask the question, why? What is different? Of course, there are differences between the two contexts, but I just want to caution against some sort of enthusiasm that Solomon thinks that it's because the young people today who celebrate the military dictators have not, like some of us, lived on the military dictatorship. I think it's part of the answer. It's the demography plays an important role there, but we'll need to interrogate why our military dictators, with some exceptions, there are exceptions, I'm not going to name them, but why they haven't been able to generate the type of economic growth we've seen somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Deso?
Thank you very much to the questions raised. Let me just add one quick point on coups. From a reaction or a response perspective, policy response by regional organizations or by the African Union, I think one very serious, a couple of very serious problems or mistakes or failures, let me put it that way. The first one has to do with the moment you enter into a negotiation with a military that took power, for it to be part of the transitional process to determine the return to constitutional order, the whole point about your zero tolerance policy to coups becomes questionable. So basically, you are opening yourself up to, creating an incentive. So, oh, okay. So in Sudan, the military took power. It negotiated a power sharing arrangement to be in charge of the transitional process, actually. Right? And the military next door obviously would see, okay, you can actually perpetrate a coup and get away with it by being in charge of what happens next. That needs to be interrogated. The second one is double standards, lack of consistency in the application of the standards. And Chad is a case in point, where a military took power without following constitutional order. And what did we do? As the African Union, we didn't follow to apply the measures that ordinarily apply in those instances. And this obviously exposes the institutions to the kind of challenge that those who actually engaged in military coup raised on the AU, raised on the on ECOWAS as well, right? So we have to, therefore, from a response, this is really after the fact, the post facto response. How it is organized and deployed matters a great deal. And the other inconsistency, of course, has to do with not just how the lack of response, I think, the lack of engagement to signs of crisis emerging. And this, We have seen it in many places. We have seen it in Guinea. We are witnessing it today. The signs are emerging in Senegal. And where is the response? What is ECOWAS doing or is going to do? What is the African Union doing or is going to do? I think those are the kinds of things that we need. And let me link this to the point about whether mediation and preventive diplomacy is in high demand. Without a doubt, the demand is enormous and high. I think the issue is really whether or not we are able to have a very crafty, technically solid, politically astute way of organizing and deploying mediation and preventive diplomacy tools. That is where the challenge is. So when we talk about, sovereignty being a problem, sovereignty has always been a problem. But why did the AU manage to deploy preventive diplomacy in certain situations? Why did ECOWAS manage to deploy preventive diplomacy and mediation in certain situations, but not now able to do that? What has changed? I think that is where we need to put our interrogation. On the G20, we produced actually an analysis just end of last week, responding to the question that my sister posed about what kind of institutional arrangement the AU and African states are putting in place for making AU's membership effective, particularly in terms of representation. Who would represent the AU at different levels and processes of the G20? So you can find that actually on Amani Africa website. This is something that myself and a very good friend of mine, Fatan Agad, wrote. So you would find actually a more detailed analysis on that question. And I invite you to have a look at that one. Lastly, for me, the question that was posed, whether the leadership crisis also has to do with the lack of engagement and participation on the part of the wider public and the citizenry. I think there is definitely a point, that is a very valid point. One aspect of the crisis indeed has to do with this. But I don't also wish to overstate the importance of participation when it comes to leadership. The leadership that we have seen that led to the transition of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, and the really commendably successful takeoff of the African Union in its first decade, for example, is attributable to leadership that has been demonstrated by leaders from different countries, the kind of working relationship that they had put in place, and of course the foundation that was laid down, as Ambassador Fred highlighted, by the Organization of African Unity under the exemplary leadership of Salim Ahmed Salim. Those are the kinds of really things you need, basically what may be called not just political leadership, but also technical and thought leadership. It's a combination of these that actually creates becomes the catalyst for mobilizing political action that is critical for effectiveness of multilateral bodies like the African Union and ECOWAS. And if this is backed by engagement of the wider African public, absolutely. That's why, for example, things that Timmy mentioned in his opening remark, the engagement of the African Union with civil society organizations, the engagement of the African Union with think tanks, with the establishment of network of think tanks for peace, those become very important in creating a wider public avenues for wider public engagement. Now, on the positive side of things, since I often talk about the more sobering stuff, on the positive side of things, let me say this. One, some of the institutions of the African Union continue to function, however unsatisfactory their functioning may be. I can mention here the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. Despite the challenge that it is facing, including the tussle between member states and the Commission, and issues of sovereignty that Fred mentioned. I think Fred also mentioned a very important point: the trust deficit between member states and the Commission. I think which also affects how we respond to crisis as well, which is critical, right? The PSC showed leadership this year in 2023 that needs to be commended. That was the case, for example, with respect to how the PSC responded to the coup in Niger. And the way the PSC responded to the coup in Niger, although initially was opposed by ECOWAS was not happy about it. In the end, it is vindicated by what ECOWAS did at the end of the day, on the 10th of December, when ECOWAS held its summit and said, you know, we are not going to go through with what we initially thought we can do with respect to the coup the coup in Niger. That is a very important one. The PSC actually did what it did on Niger, despite the fact that even the AU Commission, the level of the chairperson, was not really supportive of what the PSC was putting in place. And there we saw what leadership matters. Who is the chair of the PSC for that month, and how that chair mobilizes negotiation. And that demonstrated how this can be made to work. And that's not the only instance. With respect to Sudan, the PSC once again stood its ground. On the 27th of May, President Museveni proposed the establishment of a high-level panel, which would be fully dedicated to deal with the Sudan file. Lack of support, both from the Commission and some from the PSC, didn't allow that proposal to find its way into the final communique. 5 months later, the status quo didn't deliver and utterly failed. And the PSC came back in November and put its ground. And today we have the high-level panel, irrespective of some misgivings that people may have about the level of the high-level panel, the high-level panel. Because the PSC actually even in December said that it would be good to have the level at the heads of state, retired heads of state. You know, that is the ambition that was there. But I think these are the kinds of things that we need to commend, and these illustrate to us the agency question that I raised earlier. That is the critical ingredient that we need to invest in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I take Ambassador Fred so he doesn't feel like he's always the last on the list? Ambassador Fred, if you want to come in, please keep it brief so we can take other rounds of questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I just, first of all, I remember a quote by Winston Churchill. He used to say, "Jaw is better than war," meaning that it's always better to have to use dialogue than to go to war. Today, this day and age, you feel like people prefer to puff their chest instead of dialoguing like we used to do before. I remember I was having a conversation with my father about this, and then he says the reason is because us, we grew up listening to Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, whereas your generation, they grew up watching Rambo. So we need to really get back to dialoguing to resolve issues. Why is the first thing that people come up with is confrontation? It baffles me. I don't understand. So if we're going to try to stop interstate conflict, we need to put first and foremost dialogue rather than military might, which is unfortunately what is happening. The second point I want to make is actually the African Union is not inactive in any of these conflicts. We are working on each and every one of them. Just because it's not in the headlines doesn't mean that there's no efforts which are being made. There is actually active prevention that is happening in certain circumstances. There is dialogue, back channel diplomacy that is happening. It doesn't mean we always succeed, but it is happening at the moment as we speak in many And this is a notion actually that I would like to dispel. And I'm glad Solomon talked about the AUPSC. And if you look also at the pronouncement of the chairperson, it gives you a sense of where we are on some of these things. On the coup issue, I would like just to say that the coup is also, it's the crisis of the state in Africa. The crisis of the state in the sense that we have inherited administration, but we have not inherited states. In other words, a state which is able to respond to the most basic needs of its citizens. And until we address the crisis of the state, and I think one of my colleagues was mentioning it, and have a social contract with the people, we will continue to have this as a problem. So there is a lot that can be said, but this issue of the crisis of the state, I think, is going to be one for our generation to address. On the G20, there will be, there's a framework which has been developed and which will be adopted by the organs. Africa, they have agreed that Africa must speak with one voice on all the issues. And there is actually a task force which has been created in the Commission. And South Africa has also agreed to share some of the lessons of being a member of the G20. So there will be, this will be discussed, and the modalities about, I think, the participation of the AU in the Leader Summit, how it is, the chairperson with the chair of the union. So all these, there's some proposals which have been made and which will be there. But yes, there are things that the AU is doing in many of the conflicts. Are we being effective? Not necessarily. Can we do better? Definitely yes. But again, like we started early on, the AU, it's its member states. The AU is not the AU Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fred. So, Timmy, you happen to be the last. So 30 seconds.
Okay, so very briefly, about mediation, I think that, as I said, it's an high demand, so I won't tell so much story on that. But I'd like to note 3 points. That mediation has increasingly become a norm for many options, especially when conflicts are brewing. And we should also appreciate the fact that the AU has, over the years, placed emphasis on local level ownership of their peace and security. And as a result of that, you see at local levels, different partners or different people taking initiatives to encourage mediation even before conflicts break out. There are instances of that in Mali, even by youths, and you would see records of it in the report on the roles and contributions of youth to peace and security in Africa, which was published by the AU. And lastly, is on mediation is a lens that I think we should also throw into the mix, which is mediation sometimes, as we see in Africa, is not just about ending the conflict or solving the conflict, but it also serves as a thermostat. When things get too hot, mediation has helped to cool things down or delay things until the AU or the different stakeholders get to find a lasting solution to it. Second, the second point is on coups. Also, very briefly, is that we should also see coups as an opportunity to reset. Sometimes, because of the challenges of sovereignty of member states, sometimes there are certain structures that we need to ask ourselves what needs to be discontinued. The AU might not be able to discuss those things or address those things when that particular democratic government that was sacked is still in power. But in conversations around restoring democracy after a coup has happened, it's an opportunity to ask ourselves what structure must be discontinued in this context. And lastly is we should also ask ourselves before we preach democracy to the people, we should ask ourselves what is their democratic experience, so that when we say back to democracy, what they are interpreting from what we say is not opposite from what we mean as democracy. And we see the case in Niger, we see the case in Mali and Burkina Faso. And my last comment is on citizens' participation. The AU has made good efforts actually with the Youth for Peace program, the WPS programs, but there are limitations when it comes to citizens' participation. And at the end of the day, it still turns out to be what Dr. Andy mentioned earlier, that the AU and REX eventually become what the member states want it to be. So how do we influence or drive or encourage the political will to achieve some of these things. I mean, in context of my previous comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I take note of your very powerful point. What is the default setting when you talk about democracy for some countries? So when you say go back to democracy, what are we asking? Sometimes you might not necessarily be asking for what you are used to. And so it's a very important conversation. So it's time for second round. As usual, yes, starting with you. To the lady. Yes, the guy I missed, and then the one at the back. So let's see if we can take 2 more rounds, and then we go. Microphone, please, starting from here. I hope we will hear something from ECOWAS or something.
You know that I'm ECOWAS. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the presentation you have. I just want to intervene in 2 aspects. First aspect is the place of the conception, African conception of power and sovereignty. I want you to in your development, because institution, international institution, regional and African, we are having problem about sovereignty, about the conception of power. Not avoid. You take the example of Guinea. You can't imagine the number of missions African Union and ECOWAS deployed in Guinea before, but at the airport they will tell you, don't talk about what is happening. You can talk about everything, but not involved in our internal. So I want us to integrate that also, because every time you say lack of capacity, so. No. The 3 countries withdraw from ECOWAS. I can tell you I was part of a technical team sent by ECOWAS, each team, to work with them on the chronogram. And we agree on chronogram, and all of them in July may start having election. So I let you appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think part of the crisis is the fact that suddenly the Twitter African community, right, seems to blame ECOWAS for everything, but not the coup maker. I don't know who has noticed that, but it's a conversation we need to have. Why do we suddenly start blaming the institutions we've entrusted to implement the norms we've agreed, rather than the coup makers? So the coup makers have started looking very good. That's a very good conversation for us to look at going forward. The second one was here. Yes. Yes, the lady.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the panelists for the very interesting presentation. My name is Nedra Sharif. I'm a constitutional expert at the African Union Commission. I wanted just to come back briefly on a point that was mentioned by Dr. Solomon Derso, and maybe ask a kind of open question, because I'm not sure anyone has a clear answer to that. But I mean, I hear you when you were saying that the fact that during coups, if you interact with the military and you allow them to lead the transition, at some point you kind of contradict your anti-coup norms, and I completely agree with you. But at the same time, how would you, I would say, how would you reconcile, the norms with the reality on the ground, and how do you face this dilemma of, when these people like the military take power, usually they're here to stay, and they're here because they want to lead a transition. And so at some point you decide to implement the norms as they are in the textbook and impose the sanction and so on and so forth. But and we've seen it, I think, quite clearly in Niger. We've been very tough. The reaction have been going as far as threatening of the use of force by the ECOWAS. But at the end of the day, I mean, the military is still here. So either you decide, to not to interact with them and to stick to your norms, but then you cut yourself from the transition and you kind of lose, control of the process, or you decide at some point that you have to deal with the reality on the ground, and it's a way in a sense, you know, to at least keep some channels open and a way of maybe pressuring or influencing the transition and enabling it to move faster toward the restoration of constitutional orders, even though it's never guaranteed. But yeah, this is kind of a dilemma, and I don't think we have a clear-cut answer for this in particular, because each case and each country is very, very specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please keep it brief so we can take.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Good morning. My name is David Schwake, German embassy. I want to leave the question of course for a little bit and talk about 2719. When you look at recent peacekeeping operations or peace support operations on the African continent, they were African-led. Most of them were ad hoc coalitions, or they were run and mandated by the RECs. When you look at 2719, it asks for a mandate by the AUPSC as a requirement for UN funding. So my question is, it looks as if 2719, if used, would empower the AUPSC and the EU Commission at the expense of the RECs. So I wonder, do you share that analysis or not? Thank you.
Straight to the point. Yes.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for a wonderful presentation. So my name is Shawit. I'm representing the Embassy of Ireland. I have two somewhat related questions, very brief ones. Perhaps going to Ambassador Fred. Ambassador Fred, you mentioned one issue and also one of the things to be discussed possibly at the summit. So the issue you mentioned is the issue of sovereignty in terms of AU being able to take actions. And of course, at the summit, you mentioned a number of peace and security issues to be discussed. So, I mean, the number of issues, whether interstate or intrastate peace and security issues, keeps growing. But if AU is limited by its inability to act due to the issue of sovereignty, when is it going to be that the AU will put this question at the center of its summit discussions, for example, as opposed to discussing the issues? Because the analysis is there, we hear, we see it on the news, we all know which conflicts are emerging and which conflicts are, you know, continuing to grow and so on. But, you know, our regional institutions are not becoming as effective because of the issue of sovereignty. And I mean, this is really key because it's a cornerstone for the AU, I think, when it's trying to, you know, move from non-interference to non-indifference. So, or is this an issue of reforming the PSC? And if so, in what way to tackle this issue of sovereignty, which is not enabling action? Because Ambassador Fred, you laid cues for a number of years, which did great work, but was always able to lead to early action due to the issue that you mentioned. And maybe related to this, I heard the word trust deficit.
Shall we? You can keep it. Yes.
Should I ask this one? Quick one. Where is trust deficit coming from between AU and member states? What's the root cause of that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. The young man who couldn't ask his question the last time. Please keep it brief.
Okay, thank you so much. You will allow me to stand in case good photographs are needed. My name is Fabius Mlongo from the FES AU Corporation Office. And if I were to choose to be faithful to today's topic, is AU faring on well? If you ask this question from Cape Town, if you ask this question from Dakar, Cairo, Nairobi, Kenya, and even in the streets of Addis, most individuals will tell you the AU is not working. If it was a yes or no answer, it will be a definitely no answer. And I agree with Ambassador Fred, what he said, and Dr. Handy. I think it's a responsibility of member states to make the AU work. But if we were to take an instance of like Senegal today, what the president is doing is wrong, but we've not had the voice of the AU. The AUC Commission chairperson is not, he has not added his voice on that. So what happens in that? If foreign powers are involved in that, that's a debate for another day. And sometimes I ask one of the colleagues in my office that if you are to choose like just 2 agendas for the AU summit, for the heads of states and governments, what agendas will you give to them? He told me 3 agendas. 1, peace and security. 2, continental debt crisis. 3, regional integration through AFCFTA. But if he had asked me to give him the agendas that I would have proposed for the AU, for the heads of states, I'd have said only 2 agendas. First, the heads of states should ask themselves what is wrong with them. Then the second agenda, what can they do about that which is wrong with them? Because going forward, we need a strong AU. And sometimes I think he mentioned something about democracy. We should redefine democracy, because democracy is not just about having periodical elections, changing presidents after every 5 years, because we have countries that have the same presidents for decades and their systems are working. And that comes to my definition of democracy. Democracy is when you have systems working, health system, transport system, all the systems. And now I will pose the question to Dr. Handy in conclusion. What can institutions, what can organizations, what can individuals, what role can we play to make the AU work? Thank you.
Thank you. And how do we get the leaders to ask themselves what is wrong with them as the basis for their conversation? Very, very important. Before I come to the last person at the back, can I take the young lady here? Yes.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Soliana from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Maybe one aspect that was missing in the review of the 2023 is the major humanitarian crisis that resulted due to the various protracted conflicts that you've discussed extensively. Not only that, but we also saw a very devastating crisis due to drought and climate change in the Horn of Africa. So maybe this could be a reflection to Ambassador Fred as well, is that we were actually expecting to see a humanitarian agenda to be tabled by the Assembly, especially at a time where the world is looking more towards Ukraine and Gaza, and already conflicts like Sudan is being framed as the forgotten crisis. So I think the African Union is placed really strongly in terms of articulating the humanitarian agenda going forward, as it really wonderfully did in the COVID-19 by profiling it at a global stage, but at the same time mobilizing African member states to really to take them accountable in terms of contributing the agreed 2% from their GDP. So I think that discussion needs to happen more strongly, because if we're talking about African solution, then we need to internally start discussing in terms of taking accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I will take the last one from the back. Is it Togo? Okay, the Burkinabe Embassy, please. You have the floor. Please keep it brief. So
oui, merci beaucoup. Je suis Bernard Tago, je suis conseiller à l'ambassade du Burkina Faso à Addis Abeba. Comme vous le savez, mon pays est suspendu de l'Union africaine, donc nous n'avons pas la parole là-bas. Nous ne demandons plus la parole au niveau de la CEDEAO parce que nous nous sommes retirés. Et comme nous sommes avec l'IPSS, on espère qu'on aura plus de temps de parole quand même. J'ai juste un petit commentaire à faire et une question. Et le commentaire a trait à la crise de légitimité que traversent quand même nos organisations régionales et sous-régionales, qui ont été quand même abordées, mais qui, de mon point de vue, n'ont pas fait suffisamment mention de l'ingérence des grandes puissances auprès de ces organisations qui contribuent justement à sa délégitimation auprès des populations dans leur ensemble. Si on prend l'exemple de ce qui s'est passé au Niger, vous constaterez tous que le recours à la force qui était initialement préconisé a été pratiquement instruite par des forces étrangères à l'Afrique. Et ceci est un problème majeur que les organisations régionales et l'organisation régionale que l'Union africaine et sous-régionale doit pouvoir quand même régler. Les Africains doivent pouvoir sentir que leurs préoccupations se trouvent réglées par des organisations qui prêtent vraiment attention à leur situation et que les décisions sont prises effectivement à leur niveau. Et lorsqu'on sent que cela est téléguidé, c'est un problème majeur qui délégitime, qui décrédibilise les organisations et qui les rend inefficaces par rapport aux solutions qu'ils ont à proposer. Le deuxième point concernant justement ce commentaire, c'est la nature des sanctions qui sont infligées au pays pour raison de rupture de l'ordre constitutionnel. Alors, les causes des coups d'État ont été bien décrites ici et je le comprends parfaitement. Et vous savez que ces causes-là, les populations sont la plupart du temps victimes justement de ces questions de malgouvernance, de ces questions de sécurité. Et donc, ils cherchent qui viendrait donc juste à leur secours. Et s'il y a rupture anticonstitutionnelle, et la nature de ces sanctions est non seulement pour punir les auteurs du putsch, mais l'ensemble de la population qui se retrouve finalement entre le marteau de l'insécurité, de la malgouvernance et l'enclume des sanctions, vous comprenez que cela n'est pas en fait un moyen pour que les populations acceptent en fait ces organisations régionales-là comme recours, étant donné qu'ils ont l'impression que leur problème n'est pas compris et que ces structures ne sont pas là pour leur accompagner. Ma question qui a un lien justement avec cette question de légitimité de notre organisation régionale et de nos CR tient à la place que l'Union africaine doit occuper au sein du G20. Alors, c'est une question qui a été déjà posée cette question a été déjà abordée par ma voisine et bien répondue, mais ma préoccupation est la suivante. Comment l'Union africaine qui n'arrive pas à régler les questions endogènes en Afrique pourrait jouer un rôle utile sur les problèmes du reste du monde? Est-ce que cette union ne part pas déjà handicapée tant qu'elle n'arrive pas à montrer gage de crédibilité au sein même de ses propres populations? Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Questions around the crisis of legitimacy of sub-regional organizations, the issue of the influence of big powers, and the impact of sanctions on the bigger population. So we have just about 8 minutes with a long list of questions from the online audience. So I'm going to read them out and give you very brief time to punch the soul and spirit of the question. I think many of those we can bring up in a different context for discussions. So there's a question here from Juma Salo, all the way from Brussels. And he's asking, we appreciate the recognition of the internal failures within AU's multilateralism and the weaknesses we have in handling peace and security on the continent. But let's also point out the question around foreign intervention, which triggers all these weaknesses. Okay, so he goes on and on. So please take note of that. Tess Famreds Kylie, who is a legal and advocacy officer of PALU, the Pan-African Lawyers Union. And he is directing this to Dr. Deso. He's asking, according to your presentation, governance and checks and balances are some of the problems that led to the military takeover in West Africa, including in Niger and Gabon. He concurs that both are legitimate factors, but the issue remains that neither the people nor the military seem to lack the know-how and willingness, respectively. I would appreciate to hear your opinion on how these checks and balances can be realized. E.K. Benson, who is the AFCFTA Policy Network Deputy Executive Director, he is saying, at a time the 3 Sahel countries have expressed their fervent desire to leave ECOWAS many months before ECOWAS's 50th anniversary, does the panel believe that this is the beginning of the end for ECOWAS? He goes on and on, but I'll leave that. And there's another one to Dr. Deso. if I got you right, you argued that there is sufficient normative and institutional frameworks to deal with the challenges African countries are facing. Can you please illuminate on this and all of that? Yes, so these are the questions, and we have 6 minutes. I will ask for a few minutes extension, but for each of you, you will have 2 minutes to address it. Don't stretch it, because I may be forced to stop you. You have the floor. Starting now with Timmy.
All right, thank you. Some of the questions are linked, so I would summarize my response. The first one is that some of the questions asked border on the choice of the member states, on whether they choose to follow their political responsibility to Africans, or they choose to follow political expediency that eventually leads to crisis. My second comment is about the thriving of impunity within member states and across the continent. And that kind of delves into the questions about sanctions, which leads me to ask, when does the EU talk? If, for example, election manipulations occur or elections are postponed, these are issues that over time we already know would most likely cause a problem. So why does the ECOWAS or AU or IGA, why don't they talk at that time? Why wait until the crisis grows before they begin to talk? Which is why I have an issue with the 2 different communiques that ECOWAS released on the Senegal case. And my last response is that when it comes to elections also, even if to avoid crisis, you eventually recognize the outputs of a problematic election, at the very least, make it known, let it be clear to the people that you acknowledge that there's a problem with the process, and let there be a strategic plan that is visible to the people that this is what is being done about it. If not, a coup happens and you end up seeing the larger population supporting the coup leaders. Meanwhile, you are saying, oh, we are doing a lot, but the people don't see it, they don't agree with it. So, and that affects the image of ECOWAS and other institutions in the face of the people. We need to make sure that as much as we want to address issues at the high level, the citizens' perspectives are taken into consideration. Thank you.
Dr. Deso?
So a number of questions directed to me.
Within 2 minutes.
Within 2 minutes. Okay, a quick one. Thank you for your question. So if you go back and look at the history of AU's and ECOWAS and others' engagement to coups, it gives you a cue, basically, how they dealt with this kind of situation previously. If you take the example of Madagascar, AU and SADC actually maintained their position to the very last point, combining their engagement in terms of suspension and sanction with very robust diplomatic mobilization. So if it was possible to do it previously, why is it impossible to do it today? That is really the kind of question that I am raising, right? It is possible to maintain that zero tolerance principle. Now, the challenge that we face today compared to previous times is the level to which there has been coherence between the regional and the continental levels and the willingness of states to follow through with decisions made at the level of the PSC, for example. I think that is where we still need further work in order to address that issue. On the question of sovereignty, look, sovereignty is not a new problem. It has been there. Actually, I don't think that sovereignty is more a problem today than it was, for example, at the time of the Organization of African Unity during the OAU. It was more then than today. But if you go back and look at, for example, Salim Ahmed Salim's briefing to the central organ of the Organization of African Unity, which is the predecessor to the PSC, how he has been mobilizing action towards the resolution of the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo, how he navigates the challenge of sensitivities from the national authorities around sovereignty, around internal affairs, around designing processes that are inclusive, that are meaningful to the situation on the ground. That is basically what I think would ultimately help. So two things that I would say. If there is trust and confidence in the institution in terms of professionalism, in terms of the institution being discreet and winning the trust and confidence of national actors and authorities, in terms of its impartiality, in terms of its consistency, those are the ingredients of trust on the part of institutions that would allow national authorities to say, look, if we allow these institutions to come, they wouldn't expose us to international pressure. They would actually help us to be shielded and to create the space for us to resolve it with their support. If intervention from the AU or ECOWAS is such that it would actually open up national processes to a perceived international intervention, then obviously national authorities would be apprehensive and then would say, you guys, you just stay out of this thing. So those are the kinds of things that we need really to add and problematize. Sorry for those questions that were asked that I couldn't be able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are a bit behind time, Dr. Simon. So you will have 1 minute. Solomon took your 1 minute.
It's okay. Je crois que je répondrai à la question du collègue du Burkina Faso, à ces multiples questions. Rassurez-vous, à l'Institut, vous aurez toujours la parole. Alors, mais franchement, la crise de légitimité de la CEDEAO, comme vous l'appelez, est aussi la crise de légitimité des États qui constituent la CEDEAO. C'est trop facile d'accuser la CEDEAO pour, en fait, des problèmes qui viennent des États. Et moi, j'ai beaucoup travaillé sur le Sahel, j'ai beaucoup travaillé sur le Liptako-Gourma. Donc, c'est des pays que je connais bien. Et il ne faut pas oublier que le problème au Burkina Faso, dans votre pays, comme au Niger et comme au Mali, c'est des problèmes de gouvernance. C'est le coût qui est le problème, ce n'est pas la réponse de la CEDEAO. Donc, je pense qu'il faut déjà qu'on s'entende sur c'est quoi le problème. Le problème ne peut pas être la réaction au problème. Le problème, identifions-le. Il y a eu un coût et il y avait un consensus régional sur la manière dont on règle les coûts. Donc, franchement, je pense que, comme disait mon ami Fred, je pense qu'on a besoin de plus d'Union africaine, de plus de CEDEAO que de moins de ces organisations. Là, du coup, je deviens un militant. Comment peut-on prétendre être panafricaniste, comme certains leaders des régimes de transition disent qu'ils le sont, en justement affaiblissant les organisations panafricaines? Donc là, je pense que ce qu'il faut faire, dans un esprit de coopération et de collaboration, prendre en compte toutes les doléances exprimées par les gouvernements de transition, comme ça avait déjà été fait le cas, ça avait été le cas. On se rend compte qu'ils sortent de la CEDEAO justement quand un dialogue est entamé. Donc, il y a une contradiction là. Est-ce qu'il y avait peut-être intention de s'extraire des conditions, notamment de calendrier de la CEDEAO? Donc, c'est une discussion qu'on peut avoir. On ne pourrait pas la terminer ici, mais je serais heureux de continuer ces discussions avec vous sous d'autres formats. Merci.
Yeah, I thought because you wanted more time, you were speaking French. You went back at the right time. Thank you so much. But Dr. Deso wants to come on something later to the question from Soliana, right? But before that, please, we have an evaluation form on your desk. Please take a couple of seconds to fill them out for us. It helps us know how we are running things and improve. Solomon?
Thank you very much. Just quickly, I fully agree. One of the features of conflict trends, not necessarily specific to 2023, but it started previously, is the fact that conflicts are being orchestrated increasingly with complete disregard for norms that govern, hostilities, international humanitarian law, and so forth. And therefore, if you see 2023 in terms of one indices only, which is displacement, we have seen one of the major spikes in forced displacement due to conflict on the continent. Just Sudan alone, nearing a double-digit million of Sudanese being displaced. I think that's a very important one. Just by way of a footnote to Paul Simon, I think there is a need for investigating the failures of regional organizations in the AU as well. Are they really working as they are supposed to work? What we need is not just more of AU. I fully agree with Ambassador Fred. Better AU and better ECOWAS as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not the least, Ambassador Fred, I will use your remarks as our conclusion. So if you are still on, you have 1 minute.
In 1 minute, it's difficult.
Wrap it up nicely for us, given
Good.
your...
Let me begin with the brother from Burkina Faso. Je vais parler en français aussi. Pour le frère du Burkina Faso, vous suspendre de l'Union africaine ne veut pas dire ne pas vous accompagner. J'aimerais vous dire que même si les pays sont suspendus, on les accompagne. Et donc, je pense que on aimerait, et on va sûrement continuer le dialogue avec vous. Mais j'aimerais dire que juste parce que l'organisation continentale a des problèmes en interne, ça ne veut pas dire qu'on n'a pas droit à avoir une voix unie sur des questions globales. Vous savez, si on devait prendre ce genre de critères, l'Union européenne ne ferait pas partie aussi du G20, mais ils sont toujours là-bas. Donc, c'est pour juste vous dire que le Burkina, c'est un pays frère et on continue à travailler là-dessus et on va continuer à suivre le dialogue. Now, if I can come to the issues of queues, trust deficit, and so on and so forth, I think that there's a lot of blame to go around, whether it's us but also our member states. What I believe that we need to do is to have more dialogue and for them to see the value that we are bringing at the table. It's extremely important that we engage a lot. I often look at some of myself and some of the colleagues, the number of time we spend with our member states in Addis, and the number of time actually we spend with other partners and other groupings. And I've noticed that we spend less time with our member states then we should increase that, which is extremely important. And I know Solomon is nodding because he spends a lot of time with our member states and Paul as well. But in the AU, we need to do a bit more of that because there's a lot of misunderstanding there. On the humanitarian agenda, yes, there will be discussions on that. And of course, because it's not only Sudan. I was thinking that Solomon was talking about the numbers. In the DR Congo, I think we have 6 to 7 million displaced people as well. So it is a very, very serious issue which will be there. And I would like to highlight that you probably heard about the African Humanitarian Agency as well. So there will be probably some discussions on that. There were many other things that I would like to comment on, but I only have 1 minute, and I just wanted to really thank everybody and for the great discussions. And I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Amani Africa and IPSS, for always organizing such great events ahead of the summit. I thank you so much.
Just before you go, there's going to be lunch, so we can continue the discussion over lunch. Unfortunately, it's not the same for the online audience. But listening to everything, I think time will fail me if I attempt to summarize. But what I can say is that 2023 came across as totally different from the rest. But it appears 2024 is set for more of the same. The teams we are engaging on may be the same. Let's just keep pushing and see if we can be actors in the quest to see the Africa we want. I would like to thank you so much for coming, and we will be in touch to announce the next activity. Actually, we have another activity on the Great Lakes coming up on Friday. So please check your inboxes and take note of that. Amani Africa has an event tomorrow, which is also going to be very stimulating. See you, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for coming.